So one of my first jobs was as an events and wedding coordinator at a 4-star hotel. And shortly after I'd taken on the role, I was due to meet with a future bride and groom. And just as I was about to go into that meeting, my manager said to me, "You just need to know the groom's really unhappy. You're his third wedding coordinator, and he is quite a forceful and intimidating character, so tread carefully." Well, I was already feeling a bit nervous about this meeting anyway, because it was one of my first weddings. And I quickly went to the toilets where I prayed, and then I had to walk down this big staircase, and I was just praying that no one could see my legs were shaking as I went into this conversation. Fortunately, the conversation went really well, and the groom left happy, so that was really good. And not all conversations go so well. So last year, some of our younger neighbours decided they were going to play their music very loudly in the early hours of the morning. And this was going on during Josiah's GCSEs, and I wasn't very happy about it, and it was keeping us up. And the third weekend of them doing this, I woke up at 1 a.m. in the morning, and I was like, I've had enough. And I threw on some clothes, and I went round, and Ed and I had assumed the parents were away because of the noise of the music. And so when I got to the door and the dad came, I was completely thrown that he was condoning this behaviour. And my conversation went pretty much along the lines of, it's too much, it's just too much, it's too much. And because I was just so thrown by everything that happened, and we sort of stumbled our way through this conversation, and with me saying it's too much too many times, and then I went home to bed. So the truth is, we all have to have tricky conversations at some point. You know, there are things that come up that we have to discuss. It might be something with our spouse or with a family member. It might be with a work colleague. It might be with your boss or someone who works for you. It might be with a classmate. It might be with a teacher. It might be with a friend who's let us down. And sometimes those conversations go really well. And we come out of them, we feel like winners. You know, we've brought up a difficult topic, we've had the conversation, we've got resolution, and it's gone really well. Other times, those conversations don't go well. You know, maybe we are met with, you know, the conversation takes an unexpected turn, or maybe we get a curved ball, or maybe we, you know, are met with anger or justification or excuses, and it's just really difficult. Or maybe we're met with the cold, silent treatment. And all of this can leave us wanting to avoid those kinds of conversations. It can feel easier to avoid discussing anything that might be difficult, anything that might be uncomfortable, no matter how important it is to us or to a situation. So we don't want to rile anyone, we don't want to rock the boat, so we're like, well, let's just let that be. Let's just pretend that, you know, let's just not talk about that, let's not go there, let's let the matter rest. But the problem is the matter doesn't rest, because it's still there. And sometimes it gets worse, and there's no resolution, and so the situation just becomes more and more uncomfortable. And then resentment can grow with this unresolved issue. And then the relationship's fractured, and then it's like you're walking on eggshells, trying to avoid certain topics. You don't want to trigger them, you don't want to trigger you don't want to trigger both of you, and it just gets really difficult. But the reality is that we're surrounded by people, and so we are going to have tricky conversations from time to time. And that includes within our church family. There will be tricky conversations. Part of growing healthy, good, strong relationships with one another is that we don't avoid or ignore difficult conversations, but rather that we're able to have them and do those conversations so that we end up more close and connected to one another than when we started them. As disciples, having courageous conversations matter. If we want to grow to be more like Jesus, then we need to get comfortable having those tricky conversations because we are called to love one another. It's part of getting Jesus' church ready for his return. Each one of us is called to make his church as beautiful and healthy as it can possibly be for when he comes back. We're all called to get the church ready for King Jesus. The good news is that there is someone in the Bible who can show us the worth and the value of having tricky conversations. In the midst of Jesus' genealogy in Luke 3, we find these words: Nathan, son of David. And those 4 words demonstrate the power of being able to have hard conversations really well, including one of the hardest conversations I can possibly imagine having. So let's go back to the start. In 2 Samuel 7, we meet Nathan, and he is a court prophet, he is an advisor, and he is a friend to King David. And this is the same David who killed Goliath when he was a boy. And King David is at a point of peace in his reign. There's no fighting, things are calm, and he's in his palace, and he thinks, right, now I can pay attention to something that has been troubling him. You see, the thing is, King David lived in a palace, and the Ark of the Covenant, which was the presence of God, was in a tent. And he was like, well, I know this is wrong. I should be in a palace, and the presence of God should be in a tent, so I'm going to build a temple. And he has a chat with Nathan about it, and Nathan says, good plan, go for it, I like that idea. But then Nathan goes home, and God says to Nathan, this is not my plan. It is not my plan that David builds the temple. That's the job and purpose of one of his offspring. And now Nathan's in an awkward position. He has to have his first tricky conversation because he has to go back to the king and say, you know, I said that was a really good idea. Well, it's not. God doesn't want you to do it. But Nathan goes back to David and he has the conversation, and we know it goes well because David accepts that conversation and he changes his plans. So far, so good. The next time we meet Nathan is in 2 Samuel 12. And now it's a completely different situation. Nathan has to have a really difficult conversation with David, and it's actually one that could have cost Nathan his life if it hadn't have gone well. Israel's circumstances have changed. They're now at war, and David sends off his armies to go and fight. But David doesn't go with them. He stays back at the palace. So the men are away fighting. David has plenty of time on his hands. And one evening he walks on the roof of his palace, and he looks out and he sees the wife of one of his soldiers bathing, Bathsheba. And he likes what he sees, and so he summons men to go and get Bathsheba and bring Bathsheba to him. There he forces Bathsheba into a sexual relationship, and she becomes pregnant with a child. Well, if that wasn't messy enough, David carries on because he's now trying to cover up this adultery. And to cut a long story short, he arranges for Bathsheba's husband Uriah to be killed on the battlefront. So it looks like he was a casualty of war. He just got caught out in the battle. So David's behaviour is spiralling out of control, and everyone in the palace is aware of what's going on. And we know this because David sent his men to go and get Bathsheba. So everybody would have known what was going on, from the lowest servant to the highest court official. Everyone knew what was happening. It would have been the talk of the palace. And then David, of course, spread his mess beyond the palace by involving his leaders who are out fighting a war by asking them to deal with Uriah. Not one of those people had a courageous conversation with David. Not one of them loved him enough to call him out on his behaviour. No one said to him, David, why are you not with your men fighting? Nobody said, why are you summoning the wife of somebody else, somebody else's wife? Nobody called David out. Nobody had a courageous conversation with him, except for Nathan. Nathan has a message from God for the king to say that the Lord has seen what he has done and he's displeased. Now that's one tricky conversation to have with a king, but Nathan is courageous. He reminds David of what the Lord has done for him since he was a boy. He challenges him on his behaviour, and then he says, David, this is the consequences of your behaviour. This is the outworking of what you have done. And that included that their child that Bathsheba was expecting was going to die. Now that is an incredibly hard conversation to have with somebody. But there are two things that tell us that Nathan did this well. The first is David's response. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't justify his behaviour. He didn't make excuses. He didn't throw his weight around and say, I'm the king. Who do you think you are to tell me what to do? David's immediate response was, I have sinned against God. It was as if in that moment the scales fell from David's eyes and he saw his behaviour for what it was. And secondly, we have Luke 3, Nathan, son of David. So although David and Bathsheba's first child did die, they went on to have more children. And one of those children they named Nathan. What a demonstration of David's relationship with Nathan, the fruit of that relationship, that David and Bathsheba will call one of their children after the very man who'd had the hardest conversation David probably had had in his life, one of them. Nathan was able to deliver the news in such a way, such painful, difficult news, that they maintained their connection and their relationship with one another. And we know that they did this because later on in 1 Kings, when David's very old, Nathan is still around, and then he advises David because one of David's children is trying to take the throne from David's heir. So Nathan was someone who chose to step into tricky conversations and still maintain that close relationship. He demonstrated that it was possible to talk about really difficult things and stay connected to the other person. Nathan loved David well. He loved David enough that he was going to call him out on his mistakes. He was going to challenge him on his behaviour. And he loved David enough that he put David before their relationship. So how can we follow Nathan's example? How can we love one another well and step into tricky conversations? How can we grow to have courageous conversations that bear great fruit? Well, first of all, we need to talk in straight lines. So let me demonstrate this. Edie, can you come help? So if you imagine, Edie's me, and Edie, I can do this with the microphone, is I'm having a conversation with Amy. Okay, so this is my straight line. This is my conversation with Amy. But something happens in the conversation, it doesn't go so well. And so now I've got a bit of an issue with Amy. And rather than talking to Amy, I'm going to go and talk to Chipo about it. Give you that. And then, I'm going to ask Gemma to pray about it. And then, just to top it off, I think I'll talk to Ruth. Okay, so we definitely don't have a straight line there. And then I'm talking to Catherine. Okay, Catherine says something. And then, I'm going to talk to Meg. And I'm going to talk to Emma. Then we'll talk to Babs. And now we very definitely, thank you, don't have straight lines. You see, it's a mess. Okay, Anya and Edie are going to help by sorting out the wool. Okay, so a courageous conversation is when we talk to the person, not about the person. It's really important that we have those tricky conversations in the right place. As tempting as it is to canvass somebody else's opinion or to ask for reassurance elsewhere, our conversation needs to be with that person. It needs to be those straight lines, no veering off. We need to love people enough to bring up the issue with them. We decide we're not going to spread the mess around, and the energy that we were put into all of that, we are going to put into having that conversation with that person. Nathan didn't consult other priests. He didn't talk to the court officials. He didn't get David's wives on side. Nathan spoke to David and David alone. Just get my breath back. Right, secondly, choose your conversation well. Not everything someone does wrong needs to be discussed. If you remember last time I spoke, I talked about offence. It is to your glory to overlook offence. So you need to check in with yourself. Is this a me issue? Could I be offended? Or is it a them issue? Is it in their best interest for us to have this conversation? Nathan's conversations were about weighty matters. He wasn't talking to David about trivia. He was calling out David on things that were going to affect David in the long term. He was calling David out on where he was going to be investing his time and his energy. He was calling out David on his spiraling behaviour. So Nathan wasn't going to let David continue down those paths without having a conversation with him. Growing up on one side of my wider family, we used to have these family meals, and there would be debates, and they'd usually be political. I think debate is a bit of a generous term, because really what it was, I'm going to tell you what I think, and you're wrong, and now I'm going to try and make you agree with me. Before you have your conversation, check in with yourself about the purpose of the conversation. Is your goal just to get the other person to agree with you? Or do you actually want to understand what they're thinking? Courageous conversations are not when you're trying to force the other person to agree with you. If you're trying to make them agree with you, you could be chasing after something that will never happen. They may never ever agree with you. And that will then make that topic painful and difficult to have to talk about again, and it will make it one that you can't resolve. But if your goal is to understand one another, you can finish a conversation not agreeing with one another, but closer to one another and in connection with one another because you have understanding. Courageous conversations are not about you delivering a monologue. They're about being curious. Ask questions about the matter you're raising. Don't assume that you have the full picture. There may be information that you don't know about. There could be a whole backstory that you just don't know anything about. And you might have to admit that you're wrong. You might have to back down. Like Nathan had to admit he was wrong about the temple. He had to go back to David and say, I'm really sorry, I got that wrong. I gave you bad advice. If you're being curious when you're having a conversation and you're asking questions, you're much more likely to be listening to them than planning your rebuttal. Tricky conversations slip up when the people are just kind of thinking through what they're going to say in response to the other person. Many years ago, we helped a couple navigate a tricky conversation. They were so busy arguing and thinking up what they were going to say that they missed the fact that they actually agreed with one another. They just completely missed it in their conversation, that they were actually on the same side. Practically speaking, choose wisely when you're going to have the conversation. There needs to be enough time to do it well. So just as someone is walking out of church, or if they've got children they're responsible for, or somebody's just about to go to an appointment, that's not a good time. And you need a time where you're not going to be rushed. And don't spend a whole evening or a whole coffee with someone and then bring it up just as they're about to go. You want a time and a place where no one's distracted and that you can not rush what you're trying to say. And give the conversation some attention beforehand. What is it that you want to say? What is it that you are feeling? Is there anything that you need to work through? Is there anything that you need to let go of? So Nathan could really have let David have it. He could have walked in there and he could have said, what do you think you're doing? You're the king. You're not with your men. Why are you taking someone else's wife? Why are you plotting murder? He could have absolutely gone for him, and everyone in the palace would have thought, yeah, go for it. That's a really good thing to be saying to him. But it would not have set David up to hear God's message. When you're having a courageous conversation, you need to work through any strong emotions beforehand so that you can talk in a calm and a measured way. And when you, statements such as you always, you never, you should, really put the other person on the defensive, and so they're probably not going to listen. So that's when you need to really think about the language that you are using. When you're having hard conversations or you're challenging somebody about their behaviour, then you need to do it in a kind way, because that will really set them up to hear what you're saying. Nathan was David's friend. He loved him enough not to shy away from the hard conversations. He stepped into those difficult conversations, choosing to not let fear silence him. And Nathan's courageous conversations changed the course of David's life. Nathan prevented David from heading in the wrong direction by building the temple. He brought about the end of David's behaviour that was so appalling. And lastly, he ensured that David's legacy was protected. Nathan played such a significant role in David's life, and we all need Nathans. We all need people who are going to be brave enough to have those courageous conversations with us. People who aren't going to avoid the important issues and love us enough to speak into our lives. And this is what healthy, godly friendship looks like. This is what we want to build as a church family. That we would be a church family where we love one enough, that we are going to intentionally encourage one another, that we're going to ask the hard questions, and we're going to place a high value on those conversations. That we would choose to be a Nathan to one another, that we would learn how to have these tricky, courageous conversations so that we build strong, enduring relationships. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for Nathan. We thank you for his courage and for the way he loved David and for the example he sets us. And so, Lord, we ask that you would help